Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 15. Ah, but forgetting all things, shall I thee? No trace of the fugitive had been discovered, though £50 reward had been offered for his arrest. Only £50 offered by the Treasury. People in the neighbourhood of Ardliston thought it odd that Sir Joseph Higginson had offered no reward. Yet there would be naturally a restraining influence in the fact of family ties. If Marie Arnold was dear as an adopted daughter, her supposed murderer was allied to Sir Joseph by marriage, and he could hardly desire to see a kinsman of his late wife's in the criminal dock. The prevailing belief in Ardliston and at Ellerslie was that the sea had closed over a lunatic murderer, and that this swift end of a terrible story was about the best thing that could have happened. Nobody outside Ellerslie Park had any doubt that Braddon Mountford had killed Marie Arnold in a paroxysm of epileptic fury. The word epilepsy once having been uttered, the solution of the mystery was taken as found. The people who knew the least about that terrible disease and its influence in mind and conduct were the most boldly assertive as to its probabilities of the case, and there was no one in the neighbourhood of Ellerslie to suggest that in a criminal mystery the obvious is always the unlikely. There was a general assurance that the last word of the story had been told. The murderer had been shuffled off the scene of this world to his own and everybody else's advantage. Much suffering and disgrace had been spared to him, and much trouble and loss to time to other people. The sea and the wind had accounted for a man whose continued existence must have been an affliction to himself and a burden to others. The few county people within the influence of Ellerslie looked into their peerages and descanted upon the lucky escape of the Allendales and the Braemars and all their kindred. The poor young man was so highly connected that to have had him tried for murder would have brought annoyance and discredit into half the drawing-rooms in Mayfair, and made dinner-table conversation even more full of pitfalls than it usually is. Those Mountford girls, Sybil Higginson's aunts, and their sons and daughters had married all over the peerage. There was hardly a family of rank that hadn't a Mountford in it. And how terrible an ordeal for that aristocratic clan had Braddon Mountford's trial for murder been in the papers, the question of his lunacy or non-lunacy discussed in leaders and letters, fought over by medical specialists, clamoured about by benevolent busybodies, until the mind of fashionable London became permeated with the idea that the Mountfords were every one of them mad, and to support which thesis stories would be raked up about every Mountford who had ever worn a queer hat or thrashed a valet from time of Queen Elizabeth. Much of this hateful publicity Mr. Mountford's clan had escaped. There had been a great deal of talk about the Ellerslie murder in that part of Cumberland, but the respect felt for Sir Joseph Higginson had exercised a restraining influence over the editors of local newspapers, and the pen of the picturesque reporter had been employed under restrictions. Upon the report of the inquest, there had followed the startling news of Braddon Mountford's escape from the jail. and the chances of his having gotten away from England or perished with the luckless crew of the Mary Jane were duly discussed, but after a paragraph or two in subsequent issues, the matter had been allowed to drop, and the local press had done nothing to annoy the good man to whom the proprietors of the two local weeklies had always looked for aid in times of financial strain. But though the press might renounce the privileges of new journalism in the interests of an old friend, there were tongues in the neighbourhood, old womanish tongues, not always owned by old women, which would not forego so fair an opportunity to blacken a millionaire's character and breathe their venom on his daughter's fair name. And these tongues were busy, and these small gentry, dwelling in secluded places, afar from the burning questions of public life, were not to be deprived of their prey. In the whist club, on the tennis ground, and at many tea-tables, Brandon Mountford and Sybil Higginson and the murdered girl were the subject of low-voiced conversations, where a shrug and the nod and the half-expressed thought went a great deal further than plain speech. Sir Joseph Higginson let them talk, or knew not that they were talking. Marie Arnold was lying in her grave on the landward side of Ellerslie Church, screened from the bleak wind that blows up from the Solway Firth, after one of those terrible funerals which are always awarded, heaven knows why, to a murdered victim. People had crowded to Ellerslie from busy towns and from far-off villages to follow the murdered girl to the churchyard, and to stare at her mourners, concentrating their attention upon Sir Joseph's haggard face and grey hair, and inclined to resent the absence of his young daughter, who should have been a feature in the show. That hideous funeral, with the rabble to whom the horror of Marie's doom served as a zest to picnic basket and an excuse for an outing, was over, and had been over for nearly 3 months, during the greater part of which time Sir Joseph and his daughter had been in Germany. He had fled from the scene of the murder directly after the funeral, and Sybil had gone with him. For her, too, Ellerslie had become a place of bad dreams. The gardens and the wood she had loved so well were now clouded with a vague horror. She dared not even think of the spot where the body had been found, where Braddon had been arrested with blood-stained hands. Her maid, Ferriby, had insisted on describing the exact spot, had wanted to take her mistress there, with the tactlessness of her kind. It was an infinite relief to Sybil to leave England, and she was grateful to her father for proposing to take her to Schwalbach as soon as Miss Minchin could be recalled from her holiday. It was not so agreeable to her feelings to hear next morning that Hubert Urquhart was to be of the party. He had offered to go as a kind of gentleman courier to take all trouble off Sir Joseph's hand. "Your valet is English to the 40th power, and will be very little use to you in any excursioning," he said. Sir Joseph protested that he was not going to excursionize. He was going to the quietest place he could find, just to get himself and Sibyl away from the house that was full of agonizing associations. He wanted no one but his old servant and good little Minchin to take care of Sibyl. They would live retired from the world till the memory of that dreadful night had lost something of its haunting power, and they could venture home again. To stick in one spot and brood over the past is a way to remember and not forget, remonstrated Urquhart. You and Sibyl will come back to Ellerslie in lower spirits than when you went away. Come, Sir Joseph, be reasonable. This shocking event has pulled you down. You'll want a friend at your elbow. Sir Joseph was not in a condition to argue about anything. His brain felt dazed and dull. He let Urquhart think and act for him. As Sibyl, seeing him so broken down, aged in appearance by 10 years, had not the heart to oppose his wishes, or even tell him that Urquhart's company would be a burden to her. So they started for Schwalbach, with Urquhart and Miss Minchin and 2 servants, Sir Joseph's faithful valet of many years' service, and Sibyl's maid Ferriby, who was utterly incapable of looking after her young mistress's luggage, and in constant peril of being left behind at railway stations or losing herself in strange cities. Fortunately, little Miss Minchin was equal to the occasion and took care of mistress and maid. Her period of service was nearly at an end. This was perhaps the last journey she and her beloved pupil were to take together, the last time they were to be together as pupil and governess, and her affection was intensified by the prospect of parting. "Whatever shall I do with myself without my darling girl?" she sighed. "You'll have other darling girls, Mousie dear, better girls than me, perhaps." "Oh, no, dear, I shall have no more pupils. Your good, good father is going to allow me £50 a year for the rest of my days, and I am going back to Beverley, to my dear old mother, to be a help and a comfort to her in her declining years. There was never such a man as Sir Joseph, I think, since this world began. He is all that is dear and good. But isn't it a bit too much for you to do, dearest Minchin? Why, if it wasn't for all the care you took of me, I should hardly be alive." She checked herself with a deep sigh, thinking how much heartache an early death might have saved her. They stayed at Schwalbach in spite of Mr. Urquhart's remonstrances. Neither Sir Joseph nor his daughter were in the spirits for touring. Neither mountain scenery nor medieval architecture offered any attraction for them. The minds of both were brooding on the past, and the thoughts of each were alike gloomy. Day followed day in dull monotony. Week followed week, and still there was no sign from Braddon Mountford to show that he lived. If he landed and left England for some foreign part, it is very cruel of him to not relieve my mind of this horrible uncertainty, Sibyl said to Urquhart on one of those rare occasions when she spoke to him confidentially. "I have no belief in his escape. I believe he went down in the fishing boat with the rest of them, and be assured that if the sea closed over him, Providence was kind to us all." "I don't believe that he was drowned," said Sibyl obstinately. "He may have sailed for the Cape, and I shall hear from him by and by. No, I will not believe that he is dead." "My dear enthusiast, and to think that you had only known him for 3 weeks." There was a covert sneer in the words and the tone, which passed unnoticed by Sibyl. She attached no importance to this man's ideas or opinions. He had behaved well upon the whole during those long, dull weeks at Schwalbach. He had been useful to Sir Joseph, useful and companionable, and for that Sibyl was grateful. She was still more grateful to him for not having forced his society upon herself. He had not waylaid her in her rambles with sturdy little Miss Minchin, or intruded on her quiet evenings of study in her own sitting-room. He had tried sometimes to lure her from her seclusion, and had been occasionally successful in organizing a drive to some distant point of interest. But however picturesque the scenery, he could see that her thoughts were otherwhere. He had never succeeded in making her forget Brandon Mountford. Yet he did not despair of reaching that golden goal to which all his efforts since Marie's death had been tending. "It's a waiting race," he said to himself on that last night at Schwalbach, as he paced up and down the hotel's terrace in the grey interval between sunset and moonrise. "But the prize is such a glorious one. A man may well be patient, buoyed up by such a hope. A lovely woman in the bloom of girlhood, and a dower of $1 million or 2. Yes, it's a question of millions. Jabberwock, who writes the money article in the Outside Broker, told me that Sir Joseph Higginson is one of the richest men in the north of England, and will leave a big pile behind him when he hands in his cheques. And he has only this girl, only this one ewe lamb. The stakes are stupendous." It was August when Sir Joseph and his party went back to Cumberland, just 3 months after Marie Arnold's death, long enough, with most people, for sorrow to have assumed their milder form, which may last for a lifetime or dwindle by gentle degrees into forgetfulness. In this instant, however, grief had lost little of its intensity, and the return to familiar scenes was full of pain. Both Sir Joseph and his daughter were heroic in repressing all outward signs of sorrow, and the only change in the father was the look of age which had come upon him with a strange suddenness at the time of Marie's tragic death, together with a marked lessening of that physical energy which, a year ago, had made the active supervision of his estate an amusement and a delight. He handed over the burden of his cares to Andrew Orlebar, and rarely looked at business documents, languidly assenting to everything his secretary proposed. Had Orlebar been of a less incorruptible honesty, the great argosy of Sir Joseph Higginson's fortune might have sprung a leak. The change which grief had wrought in the daughter was less marked, and the outer world might have supposed only that Sibyl Higginson was ripening from the light-hearted girl into the thoughtful woman. But Urquhart, who marked her closely, saw that all the gladness had gone out of her young life. She had a look of anxious thought which a wife of 10 years' standing might have had in the absence of an adored husband, a look as of one whose heart is far away. All the amusements and occupations of her life had lost their savour, except only music, that divine art which, of all others, has the power to soothe and even to console and lift the mind from the actual to the unseen, to suggest, if it cannot reveal, the spiritual joys of a life beyond the grave. Music had been, after religion, Sybil's chief consoler during those dull days of Schwalbach, and now, on returning to Ellerslie, she flew to her piano in the octagon room, where the frescoes on the wall seemed to smile a welcome after the longest interval in which the lovely living face had been absent since those fair ideal faces were painted. The thought of Marie flashed into her mind as she struck the first chord of a pensive voluntary, and she seemed to hear the rich, round notes of the mezzo-soprano thrilling in the opening bars of the Agnus Dei they loved, in that 12th Mass, which, whether by Mozart or not by Mozart, will always be dear to music lovers. Yes, this was home, the familiar home and room where all that art could do had been done to surround everyday life with beauty. Sybil was glad to be at home again, even although that home was haunted by bitter memories, and the shadow of a vanished form met her at every turn of the garden or the wood, on the moorland or by the river, the shadow of her companion of 7 happy years, the shadow of the man who in a few short weeks had given new colour to her life. Both were but shadows now, one lying in the village churchyard, the other vanished, his fate unknown. As time wore on, Sybil began to believe with Urquhart that Braddon had gone down with the crew of the Mary Jane. If he were living, he would surely have made some sign. He must have understood that she would be anxious about his fate, or even if he had been so dull of brain as not to sympathize with her feelings, common courtesy would have impelled him to write to the woman who had gone so far out of her way to aid his escape. Gradually, brooding over the work of that dark night, and recalling Urquhart's share in the work, she grew to suspect some hidden motive, and that an evil one, for the part which he had taken. Her suspicions were of the vaguest, for she could imagine no reason for double-dealing on his part. Yet, now that Braddon's flight had ended fatally, it seemed to her that no gentleman should have counselled so unmanly a course, and she hated herself for having urged Braddon to act against his own convictions. Yes, it had been a mistake, and a fatal mistake, an error of judgment which had ended in ignominy and death. How much better to have faced the worst. The mystery of Marie Arnold's death might have been solved in the laborious investigation which a trial would have afforded. The keenest intelligence in the land, the quick intellect of the trained advocate, might have been brought to bear upon crime and motive. The clue might have been found, the labyrinth threaded, and the real murderer discovered. By his disappearance, Braddon had left the mystery dark, and his name disgraced. Urquhart ceased to be Sir Joseph's guest after the return from Schwalbach, but he was still a neighbour, as he had established himself for the autumn at Killander Castle, and he rode or drove to Ellerslie so frequently that it seemed to Sibyl as if he might as well lived there. She avoided him as much as possible, and spent the greater part of her life in retirement in her morning room, with no companion but the devoted Miss Minchin and Muff, the old collie dog, which had been her faithful adorer from the days of puppyhood, when his youthful spirits had found vent in boisterous gambols and races on the lawns and in the pine wood. He was old and feeble now, and liked best to lie at ease on the lion skin which Braddon Mountford had presented to her in the beginning of their acquaintance, a trophy from the shores of the Zambesi. The governess was to remain with her pupil as a companion and friend till the following spring, when Sibyl's aunt, Lady Selina Mountford, was to assume all the cares of chaperone, and was to conduct the heiress safely through the fiery furnace of smart society to a brilliant marriage. The migration to Arlington Street was to take place in February, and Miss Higginson was to be presented by Lady Braemar in the first drawing-room of the year. The Braemars were established in the family house in Hertford Street, the shabby old house within whose panelled walls Sir Joseph Higginson had wooed and won his wife. Lord Allendale was now a confirmed invalid, and spent his life between Bath and various Bohemian health resorts, ministered to by a valet who was nearly as old as himself. Braemar, the heir apparent, was to all intents and purposes head of the house of Mountford. He was a busy man, a sportsman, fond of racing, fond of all amusements that cost money, and, having very little money to spend, a man always over-occupied, upon whose crowded brain even the most awful episode in the family history, as Braddon Mountford's arrest on a charge of murder, had made no deep impression. He had written to Sir Joseph, expressing horror at the tragedy and sympathy with the friends of the murdered girl, together with his opinion that Braddon could not have done the deed, or could only have done it in a fit of lunacy. Mother died mad. A very sad history. Nothing bad on the Mountford side. Foolish marriage. Know very little of the young man. This letter, in Braemar's jerky style, natural in a man who conducted his private correspondence chiefly by electric wire, had been the only notice taken of the Ellerslie tragedy by the house of Mountford, which had a happy knack of dropping any member who got into trouble. With such an immense family as ours, if we didn't cut the black sheep, we should always be in the law courts, said the philosophical Braemar. Our time would be taken up in watching Tom, Dick, and Harry, through their troubles. End of chapter 15.